Hey everyone, today we're discussing some of the strongest powers the game has ever had as we look back through the history of DBD. Spirit is the clearest case of a character having a ridiculous number of strong elements to their power and quite clearly being problematic. The biggest strength she used to have was the fact that she used to have collision when phasing, which allowed her to easily locate survivors as she could literally just bump into them. Nowadays you have to solely rely on both sound cues and visuals such as scratch marks or small changes in the environment such as moving grass. There were also just odd things about her that were added at the time and appeared intended despite how broken they seemed. For example, Spirit didn't have a vaulting animation. When she went to vault a window, you would see her on one side and then she would simply shift over to the other. This played into one of the main strategies at the time for Spirit, and one that became fairly famous due to its ease of use. This strategy was, of course, standing still. That's right, one of the main old Spirit strategies was to stand still at a window or pallet, and as there was no directional sound cue like there is now, you would have no idea whether or not she was phasing, often leading to people making wrong predictions, and vaulting right into the hands of Spirit. It was really bad, and it wasn't engaging at all really. Spirit did have some downsides in the early days though, although fairly minimal. The main downside was almost definitely the far longer recovery speed, which sat at 20 seconds for a long time before being changed to the current 15. Her earlier iteration would also have slightly audible breathing whilst in phase, which was then removed in favour of both no breathing and no sound at all when you were within Spirit's terror radius, and she began a phase. You would only hear her static sound outside the radius, and it wasn't even directional, much like Huntress's lullaby. Spirit has always been pretty blessed when it came to add-ons. For the longest time she had the highly powerful mother-daughter ring. After her large buff she also received the highly powerful prayer beads bracelet add-on, which would remove the sound made when phasing entirely. This meant anywhere on the map at any time you couldn't hear her phasing, a bit like Silent Bell for Wraith. It was ridiculously powerful and lasted a surprisingly long time before it was eventually nerfed. It's what led to a common strategy of Gen grab Spirit, where you would have no idea if she was coming as she could begin her phase away from you when you weren't in her terror radius and suddenly pull you off a gen and there was no way to know. Nurse had a bunch of really scary early things about her, like her 7 possible blinks. However, I have some things you might not know. For example, it wasn't originally possible to light burn her, this mechanic being the ability for a survivor to shine a flashlight onto Nurse to pause her blinks, and to stun her if shone during her blink charge. The latter effect has recently been removed. Nurse also originally had a movement speed of 4 meters per second instead of the current 3.85 meters per second. Many of her upsides were nerfed fairly quickly however. Her movement speed was reduced down, her max 7 blinks was changed to 5, so still very powerful. Her default blink number went from 3 to the 2 we know today, still barely a downside. She also got light burn added to her, which is a nice little counter mechanic to have, but is ultimately pretty worthless against the sheer force of the Nurse. Two bigger things that definitely did make her weaker back then was that she used to be unable to adjust the distance of her blink mid-charge, like you can now by aiming lower or higher. She also couldn't blink up or down different levels, into basement or onto the second floor of a building, which is slightly restricting. This too was also adjusted to how we know it in a fairly early patch. This is where I think she was probably at her strongest. 5 possible blinks, she could blink anywhere she wanted, and she still had a number of very strong add-ons. Nurse back then was truly a powerhouse, and I'm really glad that 3 blinks is only available through her fairly average iridescent add-on. Nurse is still powerful today. Even with some of her downsides back in the day, she was still very powerful, and in her post-buff state, she was likely the strongest she will ever be. In the early days of DBD, Trapper and his traps were actually very strong, in some ways. This one is kind of with an asterisk because some parts of Old Trapper were utterly busted, and other parts were pretty terrible. Still, I think it's interesting to touch on the parts of the power that were incredibly overpowered. Everything back then was very much just an exaggerated version of how the game currently is. Both sides had very broken things. For trappers, some of the big things were the ability for traps to be placed directly underneath hooks, and extremely close to one another to the point where they could apparently overlap. This of course was very strong, as it would allow you to permanently trap someone on a hook. These are the days too of no base kit borrowed time, making it even harder. If someone wanted to, they could just straight up trap one person. Whoever came to save would also be forced to unhook from the front, as multi-directional hooks hadn't been implemented yet, essentially forcing them to interact with the bear trap. Traps could also be placed in other questionable areas, such as on top of the hatch, and on some occasions, due to clipping issues, would be largely invisible when placed. One notable downside bear traps had was the ability for survivors to sabotage them, much like you can now with a hook. Sabotaging traps or hooks back then would permanently remove them from the trial. You were only able to sabotage with a toolbox though, or saboteur I believe too, where it would take 8 seconds, and disarming took 3 seconds, so it was a definite time sink. The other notable counters were things like Old Small Game, which practically acted as a direct counter to Trapper. The original perk literally just worked on Trapper, and would reveal bear traps when standing within 6 meters of them. Slippery Meat was another perk that countered him, increasing both the speed and chances of freeing yourself from a bear trap. Finally, traps took a lot longer to set. If you watch gameplay from back then, it's actually kind of painful to see the slow lumbering animation. Some aspects of this power were undoubtedly overpowered, but equally there were some aspects that seem incredibly weak too. Hillbilly is another early days character that was very strong. He was the strongest character upon release of the game, and was likely number 2 for a good year or so also. The main change and the main thing that nerfed him into obscurity is the renowned patch 4.1.0, which gave him an overheat mechanic on his chainsaw, and gutted a bunch of his stronger add-ons. Pre this nerf though, he wasn't in his strongest state. That came far earlier in the game, when he had access to much better add-ons as well as perk pairings. Prior to the overheat mechanic, Billy was able to use his chainsaw as much as he liked, without it ever overheating. This allowed for a strategy known as feathering, which is where you could continuously slightly tap the chainsaw to force pallet drops or simply scare a survivor into doing something you wanted. It could also be used to fake sprints and generally make getting downs easier. This is less doable now with the chainsaw overheating when tapped like this. Billy also didn't make a sound when he began a sprint, unlike he does now, where he screams out. All you would hear is the chainsaw, making the sprint start harder to discern, particularly from a distance. One of the things that made Billy really stand out back then though was his add-ons. He still had his engravings, the original spiked boots, as well as Thompson's moonshine, before it was decommissioned, which gave greater steering. The main or particular ones that were strong though were the add-ons that allowed him to charge his chainsaw faster. These were both the Carburetor Tuning Guide and the Primer Bulb. Carburetor Tuning Guide gave a plethora of effects. The chainsaw charged faster, you would recover faster after hitting an obstacle, and it would make the noise range of your chainsaw noises shorter. Primer Bulb was the yellow version of it, and simply reduced the charge time of the chainsaw. These two add-ons allowed what was known as Instasaw Billy, a fast charging chainsaw that allowed for insanely fast charge ups and downs. Instasaw was even more powerful when paired with the old Tinkerer. Tinkerer originally had an entirely different effect, and made add-ons that affected charge time on your power 15% more effective. This applied to Billy's charge time add-ons, allowing his already fast speeds grow by an additional 15%. Executioner is a character I wanted to mention. Although he is definitely stronger to a lesser degree than many of the characters I've mentioned here, his power used to be quite strong, and it was partly down to the time frame he was released in. Executioner released at the peak of a meta of survivors using a whole bunch of anti-tunnel perks, the primary part of this meta being Decisive Strike and Unbreakable. Decisive Strike originally had no restrictions after being unhooked, meaning you could work on a generator and the DS would remain active. This allowed survivors to play in the killer's face without consequence, as if they were downed they would simply use Unbreakable. If they were picked up, they were DS. It was a really horrible time, to be quite honest, and the perk was used completely incorrectly for game delay. Well, Pyramid Head of course came with the ability to cage, where he could bypass this strategy completely if the survivor was tormented, so that's one reason. There were other elements that made him even stronger though. For example, you used to be able to see survivors after caging them, revealing their location. You also were able to stand close by to the caged survivor without the cage teleporting, and you could somewhat body block it. He was also a better chaser. Nowadays when you cancel your ranged attack, you do a little jitter, and you're unable to attack for a second. Back in the day you could cancel instantly, which would allow a strategy where you could have your ranged attack readied at something like a window whilst chasing a survivor. If they vaulted, you got the hit. If they dodged, you instantly cancelled and then swung at them, often making any vault location a guaranteed hit if played correctly. It was very strong. Alright, well that's gonna do it. What's the strongest state of a power you remember? Let me know down below. Thanks, and goodbye.